iGlobenews brings global views.
I'd like to welcome our listeners to another edition of iGlobenews, our weekly podcast where we discuss current events and world politics. My name is Diana Mautner-Markov. I'm editor-in-chief of iGlobenews.org. And today I will be discussing, as every week, with world-renowned China expert Professor Susanne Weigelin-Schwirtzig. Our topic, namely, Europe regaining relevance or destined for division. And for the record, today is April 23rd, 2026. On the occasion of the 80th anniversary of one of Germany's main newspapers, Die Zeit, President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, made the following statement, and I quote, "We must succeed in completing the European continent so that it does not fall under Russian, Turkish, or Chinese influence. We must think bigger and more geopolitically." End of quote. Von der Leyen added that Europe's previous model, relying on cheap Russian gas, low-cost labor from China and imports, and security from the United States, has come to an end, stating, quote, "We must completely reposition ourselves. We must become more independent. We must think bigger." Turkey is a longtime EU candidate country and a key NATO ally. Turkey's Nationalist Movement Party, MHP, is a close ally of President Erdogan and is proposing a Turkey-Russia-China alliance. President Erdogan supports this initiative. MHP Deputy Chairperson Ilyas Topsakal recently traveled to Moscow to hold talks. He described the proposal as an alternative to a U.S.-Israel evil coalition. That was a quote. That wasn't my words. Von der Leyen is being heavily criticized by a number of MEP members and the former European Council President, Charles Michel, who stated, quote, "Europe doesn't get stronger by applying double standards or simplifying reality." End of quote. Von der Leyen is dividing the world into what she considers worth including in the EU and those who she doesn't want to include in her new EU vision. Is von der Leyen not part of the problem as she seems disconnected from reality? In your opinion, should Europe consider a closer relationship with Turkey?
Thank you very much for this interesting question that will open a very interesting discussion, I think. All in all, I think that von der Leyen is actually trying to position Europe as a major power in world politics. And she does not understand that Europe is not a world power, that Europe is not a major power in world politics, but it's only a middle power that actually needs to align itself with all major powers, which obviously the European Union did quite successfully in the past by aligning with Russia for resource needs, with China for a market and a very cheap labor force, and for the US for security reasons. That was a typical middle power policy. And now she is trying sort of to pretend that under the given constellations, Europe could be a major power. I think she's totally wrong. And the players in Turkey, they observe the mistakes that the European Union is making, and they design a very interesting middle power policy. Because Turkey obviously has the potential of being a middle power by itself without joining the European Union or any other organization. And for that reason, actually, Turkey is playing the game of multi-alignment. It is a member of NATO, but it is also a dialogue partner, if I remember correctly, for the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. It has been a partner for the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is basically run by Russia and China for a long time. And it has recently actually applied for full membership, which was not accepted, I think, because of the implications this would have. It would be the first NATO country actually to join a organization that is run by the enemy of NATO, which is, of course, a little bit of a difficult constellation. Anyways, I think that Turkey is sort of playing the game of middle power quite well and skillfully, while Brussels has a wrong assessment of the European position in the world order and therefore makes one mistake after the other.
Could it also be that Turkey does not align with maybe Europe's close connection with Israel, also its historic connection with Israel? Turkey has joined the ICJ case, the South African case, the genocide case brought against Israel, including other 19 countries, I think, have joined or are about to join. And as we know, Turkey is a longstanding a candidate to join the European Union. But owing to multiple factors, talks have more or less come to a standstill in 2016, not least because member states Greece and Cyprus had conflicts with Turkey, which are also historically motivated, and also because Turkey had military operations in Syria, Iraq, Libya, and the Caucasus. Do you think that it would be wise for Europe to rethink taking Turkey on as a member?
Well, from its geographical position, Turkey obviously is a country that connects Europe and Asia. And this geographical position has a major impact on the policies the actors decide on in Turkey, but also on the policies other actors in the region decide on. And because Turkey has this sort of bridging role between Europe and Asia, it is both a very important country for Europe and a very important country for Asia. And the only way how Turkey can actually sort of win the competition between different actors in the Near East and become what I think President Erdogan actually wants Turkey to be, the dominant power in the region, Turkey has to use this special position between Europe and Asia. And for that reason, Europe should calculate very intensively how they actually sort of align or do not align with Turkey. So with regard to Israel, one of the reasons why Turkey is so active in this region is because, as I just mentioned, from my point of view, Erdogan has sort of nostalgia for the Ottoman Empire. And of course, he knows that under our current conditions, he cannot rebuild this empire, but he at least wants to show that Turkey can have a major impact on the Near East. And I definitely think that he also would hope for Turkey to be aligned with Europe because he understands this bridging function of Turkey because of its geographical position. So it is, from a structural point of view, it is very well understandable why Turkey is not a friend of Israel. So that's very well understandable. And it's quite clear that there are at least three actors. There are actually more than that, but there are at least three actors in the Near East region, which is Turkey, which is Iran, and which is Israel, which want to be the dominant country in this region, right? And Turkey has a very special sort of precondition for this, which is its bridging function. But the European Union makes Turkey weak insofar it does not allow for Turkey to play this role. So if we look at Israel, Israel has the US supporting its claim for a dominant power, to be a dominant power in the region. Iran has at least some support from Russia and China. And so how about Turkey? So Turkey's most natural ally would be the rest of Europe. But the rest of Europe, as it is closely aligned with the US and closely aligned with Israel, cannot support Turkey. Understanding more or less, they usually do not speak openly about this, but understanding more or less that if Europe supported Turkey, Europe would at the same time support Turkey's claim to be a dominant power in the Near East region. And they definitely don't want to do this because this would sort of induce lots of trouble with the US on the one hand side, with Israel on the other hand side. So this is one of the sort of hidden reasons that are usually not being talked about in public, why the EU is actually playing the kind of game they're playing. So should they change their policy? I think we always have to think about, if we reject a certain country, which kind of allies will this country actually look for because we do not support them? And it is quite clear, and we can see very vividly that Turkey is trying to get closer to Russia. It tries to get closer to China, but at the same time, it does not want to endanger its position in NATO because Turkey is behind the US, the second largest army in NATO, and for that reason, a very, very important ally in NATO. And if NATO loses Turkey, then this is really a really big problem. And for that reason, I think Brussels will have to sort of think about its possibilities to avoid sort of pushing Turkey out of Europe, pushing Turkey out of NATO, and giving SCO, for example, the opportunity to include with Turkey an emerging market country, a country with a comparatively big population, and a country that has an enormously big army. So for that reason, I think from a pragmatic point of view, it would be very important for Brussels to reconsider its policies towards Turkey.
So next to Turkey, there are, of course, 8 other candidates for membership for the European Union, those being Albania, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Georgia, Moldova, Montenegro, North Macedonia, Serbia, and of course, Ukraine. Kosovo, the independence of which is not recognized by 5 EU members, is also seeking to become an EU member. So what one sees when one looks at this list of countries which are interested to join the European Union is that except for Turkey, really, none of these countries are financially strong and would likely be net recipients of EU funds rather than net payers into the European pot. Already now, it is very difficult to come to any decision within the bloc. And starting with the war in Ukraine and now with the war in Iran, the economy of the EU is, of course, slowing down. The IMF has revised its projections for the EU. The outlook for the euro area is projected at just 1.1%, and for the European Union as a whole at 1.3%. So my question to you is, will enlargement lead to a poorer and even more divided Europe?
Well, of course, we know from all the kind of research that exists on regional organizations that if the number of membership countries grows, then there is always more division than less division. On the other hand, we have recent research saying that in this globalized world, which is now in a very difficult situation, where supply chains are being endangered by all kinds of geopolitical conflicts, regions matter more than we even thought of regions mattering in the past. So, with other words, if the sort of economic region of Europe can be enlarged, this might be a good preparation for future problems that we might encounter with regard to supply chains and products and goods coming from other continents of the world and meeting with all kinds of logistic problems because of geopolitical turmoil. So from that point of view, expansion is a good idea. However, there are other reasons why expansion is really very, very dangerous. And I think that this is one of the reasons why the EU so far has never come to the final decision of even accepting more member states, except for Ukraine, because in the case of Ukraine, this is, of course, a question that is not related so much to economy, but more to politics and security. So I see that if the European Union sort of tries to expand on the terms it has provided and it has demanded so far, it will not be able to expand. So if we consider the idea that economically united region is good for the member states of the future European Union, then we also have to think about the conditions under which these countries actually become a member of the EU and the expectations that the EU has vis-à-vis these countries. So, for example, all the countries that you have mentioned as potential candidates for EU membership are countries with a comparatively lower level of economic development. There are also countries with lower wages, countries with, many of them at least, a comparatively young population. So all this is what we are missing in the EU. We have very high rate. We have a comparatively old population. And for that reason, I think there are good reasons to say, why don't we enlarge the EU by these countries? But if we sort of give them the expectation that by joining the EU, their level of income, their level of wages, their level of consumption, and so on and so forth, will all be equaled within a comparatively short period of time, as we did, for example, in the context of reunification in Germany, then I think we will sort of miss, for the EU as a whole, we will miss sort of the opportunity that arise from having these countries join the EU. At the same time, we are talking about future member states, being in the 30s. We hear now discussions from Brussels saying, we can no longer adhere to the principle of consensus voting in all aspects that relate to fundamental questions of the EU, including questions of security and foreign policy. It is very clear that if we add new members, we will run into even more difficulties in coming to decisions regarding foreign policy. And so I think the EU will also have to rethink what is actually its core issue. So I don't adhere to the idea that the European Union should be a continent, like Mrs. von der Leyen said in her recent articulations regarding the future of the EU, because I think we have to see that Europe is a continent from which the idea of nation states originated. All membership countries of the EU have a history of being a nation state. Under these conditions, to unite these countries so that they give up their memory of being a nation state and try to sort of define a common interest, I think is impossible. So we cannot compare ourselves with the United States, because the United States was created as a process of nation building. So it was not created on the basis of already existing nations, but it was created as part and parcel of a process of nation building. And this is a totally different constellation. And I think it is totally misleading to think that the European Union could in future sort of be a world power because it organizes itself according to the model of the United States of America. I think this is totally wrong. And one of the reasons, to come back to sort of the beginning of our conversation on this issue, one of the reasons why now Brussels hesitates and the other the member states of the European Union hesitate to accept more members is that if they really aim for sort of creating a regional organization, again, according to the model of the United States of America, then the fact that they have more members will make things even more difficult. And this is the reason why they cannot come to this decision at this moment, or at least one of the reasons.
So Europe is in a real crossroads at the moment because it's already so divided as it is now, and making it bigger isn't going to solve its issues. Another issue, which of course is dividing Europe extremely now, is its relationship to Israel. And what was in the news very lately was the recent vote on the EU-Israel Association Agreement. And I want to bring our attention to Article 2 of this agreement, which stipulates the respect for human rights and democratic principles. Now, of course, we have Israel, which has just passed an apartheid law for the execution of Palestinian terrorists, which does not apply to anyone who is not Palestinian. So it does not apply to Israel's Jewish population. So there are already serious doubts there regarding human rights and democratic principles, which, of course, are held up high in Europe. And then, of course, we have Israel's genocidal war on Gaza, what Israel is now doing in Lebanon, the offensive war it launched with the United States on Iran, all the thousands of people that have been killed in the past years. And of course, we have the whole issue of Israel's IDF actively targeting journalists. Just the other day, 2 days ago, it killed the Lebanese journalist Amal Khalil and targeted the area where she was sheltering in. 1 month ago, it killed 3 other Lebanese journalists. And the Committee to Protect Journalists, the CPB, has said that Israel has killed more journalists since it started its research in the year 1992. So Israel is really doing things that a democratic country should not be doing. So the EU has clearly double standards here when we see to how it responded to Russia's invasion of Ukraine and how it is judging Israel now. Let us not forget that on October 23rd, 2025, the EU passed its 19th package of sanctions against Russia. Israel is allowed to take part in all football events, all sports events, in the Eurovision contest, which is just going to be held in less than 1 month in Vienna, in Austria. It can participate under its own flag. All these things are not allowed for Russia to do. Russia was kicked out of FIFA by UEFA. It is not allowed to participate in the Eurovision anymore. Let's not forget the genocide case, which South Africa has brought at the ICJ, and also Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant. There are active arrest warrants at the ICC. So the fact that the EU cannot even come together to suspend the EU-Israeli Association Agreement. And I notably say that Germany and Italy are the 2 big population countries which have voted against this. Estonia also has voted against this. But in this case, even if only Germany or Italy would change their vote, they could suspend it. They could not revoke it, but they could suspend it. Also, a civil petition now, which has gone through all member states, and over 1 million people have signed this civil petition to suspend this agreement. So the question is, why is this double standard of Israel versus Russia? And is the EU not eroding its own standards by upholding these double standards? It's just making the EU weaker and eroding it from the inside, because no one is really taking these standards then seriously anymore if you don't apply them equally, because that's the whole point of having these standards.
Mhm. Well, I must tell you that I'm a realist in the assessment of international relations, and therefore moral arguments don't really count for me. And for that reason, I think that everything you just told us actually provides proofs for why we should not look at international politics from a moral point of view. Because this double standard issue, if you look at it from a realist point of view, you can easily find an answer to this conundrum, because it is very clear that for the European Union, at this particular moment, we need an enemy to preserve the kind of unity that we have at this moment. If we didn't have Russia as our common enemy, then I think the division among the member states of the EU would be even more prominent. So we need this Russia issue as an issue we can unite against. And for that reason, we have the highest moral standards in criticizing, in rejecting, in sanctioning, in penalizing, and everything related to Russia. On the other hand, the support for Israel, of course, for some member states, especially for Germany, have a very, very clear historical reason. But it also is a signal we give in trying to align ourselves with the US. We know that for the US, the support for Israel is like nearly an existential question. And for that reason, President Trump joined Israel in going to war against Iran, although many people told him in his country that this would be a totally wrong decision. But for the US, the relationship to Israel is of major importance. And the US has defined the criterion for who is my friend and who is my foe very much against the background of whether or not this country aligns with Israel, yes or not. And for that reason, the European Union is in a very difficult situation. They know very well that Germany could never support the idea of not having this special relationship to Israel. For that reason, all the other countries can openly or more or less openly articulate their criticism, articulate their doubts and everything, because they can rely on Germany and in this case Italy as the two, with regard to the population, I think the two biggest populations among the member states of the European Union. And they know, okay, if they reject this, then we are not in danger, right? And the European Union as such can give a signal to the US that we are still supporting the idea that Israel needs to be supported in the Near East, no matter what it does. And of course, the US doesn't criticize Israel because, as we discussed in earlier conversations, Israel is like the proxy for the US in this region, and the US wants to dominate the region. For that reason, it has to support Israel no matter what, right? So if you look at these power constellations, you will see that the moral arguments we get for this or that decision that leaders of this or that country take are sort of arguments that they give to the public because they think that the public actually understands them better than arguments which are related to the power structure of the relations between different countries in this international setting. And for that reason, they give us the moral thing. And of course, they always tell us in Brussels that for the EU, these moral criteria are of major importance. But I think that this is also some kind of camouflage policy. You signal to the US that you do not question their assessment of the position that different countries have in this world by giving a totally different definition by which you assess the position of a country in the world, right? So this is also a way how you can actually hide away from any kind of conflicts with the US, for example, because you have a different assessment of the power constellation than Washington has. So you can hide away, you can pretend, here we in Europe, we are not the realists that really think deeply about power constellations. We are the people sort of who uphold moral standards. And by this, you can sort of avoid any kind of conflict with Washington. I think this is also one of the reasons why we are being fed also by our media with this moral arguments, although I'm sure that the people in Brussels and the people in the different capitals of the member states, there must be some at least who think realistically about what is going on in this world, and they know better, but they wouldn't speak up.
So let us stay on the subject of Russia. You very nicely described how Europe needs a common enemy. And of course, Russia has been built up to be this common enemy. This past weekend, Rumen Radev's Progressive Bulgaria Party won Bulgaria's 8th general election. They've had so many elections, but it's won its 8th general election in 5 years and has now secured the absolute parliamentary majority, breaking a long cycle of instability. Radev ran on fighting the, quote, oligarchy governance model. Radev opposed military aid to Kiev and is, of course, not so critical of Russia. He stated that he would continue on its European path, but he called for pragmatism towards Russia. Neighboring countries also have to now take heed of this. Romania and Greece, both NATO and EU members, with strong interests in the Black Sea, and security and regional interests and stability interests, will want Bulgaria anchored firmly in the Euro-Atlantic structures. North Macedonia also has reason to worry because Bulgaria has blocked Skopje's EU access path since 2020. Radev has criticized Brussels for remaining captive to its own ambitions to be, quote, a moral leader in a world with new rules, end of quote. Will Bulgaria follow Slovakia in pulling the EU closer to Moscow? Would this mean more division in the EU, or is this the new normal?
very interesting developments. And I think Bulgaria is a very interesting case. You have so many elections until you finally come to an election that sort of has an outcome which maybe is better to handle than all the outcomes before, to be very, very, very polite in assessing the situation. All in all, I think it is very interesting to see that those countries that we in the more Western part of the EU are usually being told as being countries that have these enormous experiences with the Soviet Union and therefore are very much afraid of Russia and therefore want a very strong anti-Russian policy, that obviously the population in these countries come to a slightly different assessment of the situation, which, by the way, is also true for the eastern part of Germany. And so, because Poland is such an anti-Russian sort of opponent among the EU members, and maybe one should talk about the reasons why, so people tend to think that what we observe in Poland is true for all the former Soviet bloc countries, and it's not. It's very interesting, for example, that the Czech Republic also recently in their elections actually came to a solution which is somewhat similar to Slovakia, somewhat similar to Bulgaria, and I would even go so far as to say somewhat similar to Hungary. So they don't want a clear decision on either pro-Russia or contra-Russia, but they want a third solution. Very interesting. I mean, we talked about this idea of a third solution in the context of China. We said, interestingly, China always comes up with this third solution. Then we talked about Hungary during our last conversation, saying, very interestingly, Hungary is among all those European countries very often the first one to opt for a third solution. Right? And here again, we have an election that comes to a third solution, neither 100% against nor 100% for Russia. So why do they come to this conclusion, and why do their political actors actually allow for their electorate to come to this conclusion? This is because basically the population in these countries is split. There are some people who want to go with Russia, and there are people who want to go against Russia. So if you go for this black and white solution, you are unable to gain a majority, because the population is so deeply split. But there is not a clear majority for this one and a clear majority for the other, because there is quite a number of people who are neither for nor against Russia. They want the third solution. And so now we can see in Bulgaria that you have to repeat your elections time and again until your party or one party in this multi-party system finally recognizes that it can only join a majority if it goes for a third solution. This is true for Hungary, and this is true for Bulgaria. I think this is a really, really interesting development. And it shows that, the electorate in the European Union member states is quite clever. Look at the situation in Taiwan. The Taiwan people actually elected a president that is a clear pro-independence president. But only 32% of the electorate gave him the vote. At the same time, they have a parliament in which the opposition parties, which are either for a comparatively close alignment with China or for at least a modus vivendi with China, they have the majority. So this president sort of hangs here in the air and cannot do what he actually would like to do because he has a parliament in front of him that in its majority will not follow his political decisions. And it's also a third solution that they found. And actually, for most of the time, since they democratized their system, have they actually casted their vote in such a manner that the parliament balances the president or the president balances the parliament. And this is what we see in Eastern Europe. And I think it's very interesting because we Western or more Western European people tend to say, oh, these countries in the eastern part of Europe, they lived under dictatorship for so long, they don't really understand democracy. Maybe they do.
But maybe another country, because today our conversation is not only the EU, but Europe. So we're going to also, we have discussed Turkey. Now let's bring in the other big white elephant in the room that left the European Union is Great Britain. So one would think that Great Britain would also have a fundamental idea of the democratic principles on which it is founded or which its democratic system is founded. But an investigation in Great Britain has shown that 12 British universities, including Oxford University, have paid for a security firm to spy on pro-Palestinian students. We see German police cracking down on pro-Palestinian supporters, for instance. So while Europe prides itself on freedom of speech, the UN Special Rapporteur for Freedom of Speech and Peaceful Assembly, her name is Gina Romero, has said, quote, the use of AI to harvest and analyze student data under the guise of open source intelligence raises profound legal concerns, end of quote. And on the 13th of February, 2026, London's High Court has now taken away the law that the British government had passed designating the Palestine Action Group as a terror group. And it said that this law was unlawful, disproportionate, and breached free speech rights and freedom of assembly. So the court underscored the constitutional importance of protecting these political expressions. And this is, of course, the core of any democratic society. If you cannot voice your opinion freely and are going to be subject to any legal action, that's, of course, not what democratic societies are about. And this brings me then to a corollary. For instance, China has long been criticized for its social credit system, which is a government-led surveillance initiative that assigns ratings based on citizen behavior, combining financial, social, and legal data to reward, quote, trustworthy behavior and penalize, quote, untrustworthy actions. So are European nations moving into a surveillance and censorship state like China? And how can we criticize China if our own governments are doing the exact same thing? Will this not lead ultimately to more division and distrust within the EU and within Europe in general?
I think we have been observing since the beginning of the war against Ukraine that when the leaders of our countries come into crisis and when they feel that they are actually losing in institutional legitimization because, for example, the outcome of elections is not as expected. The AfD is growing, for example, in Germany, and you don't want to collaborate with her, so you're actually undermining your own system because one of the major actors in your system cannot be your coalition partner. All these things actually undermine the legitimacy of the democratic system. And we know that if a political system, no matter what kind of system it is, so this implies that this is also true for autocratic systems. So if a system, no matter what kind of system it is, loses in legitimacy, then it will always revert to coercive means in trying to uphold its stability and to overcome this crisis and to make people unable to sort of subvert the system because they feel that the system has lost legitimacy. So from a systemic point of view, it is very interesting to see that we have the exact same reactions, no matter whether we are talking about a democratic system or a non-democratic system. Because in the past, we thought that non-democratic systems lack fundamentally in legitimacy. Therefore, they rule without legitimacy. But we see, like, for example, a country like China can rule by autocratic means for many, many decades. And if you relate to the people in China that are being ruled by the CCP, they will sometimes tell you, oh, you know what? I'm feeling quite free. I can talk to my brothers and sisters and cousins and colleagues about every issue I want to talk about. Nobody surveys me. But then there are other times where they say, you know what, we better don't speak about this issue. Or they don't even relate to you because they know that if they relate to you, it is already dangerous for them. So there are up and downs that we can observe very clearly, for example, in China. And now we encounter that these up and downs are also true for democratic systems. And when we go back to the Cold War era, we will see that the system was very much aware of a potential loss of legitimacy and therefore was comparatively free if we see what the situation is like at this moment. So as we lost our opponent that we had during the Cold War, against which we not only had to sort of convince our population that we had the better system by economic means, by means of security, but also by means of everything that was related to ideology and politics and things like this. So we lost this sort of counterpart, and now we feel under legitimacy pressure and forgot how we can handle this in a way that is not coercive, right? And of course, I mean, we have a hot war in the middle of Europe. And this is actually, I think, more dangerous than any situation we might have gone through during the Cold War. So this accounts also a little bit for this tendency towards coerciveness. What I think is really a really big problem is, why is our system not able to show that it can deal with the crisis of legitimacy with means other than coercion? Why can we not show, when we are being taught every day that there is a fundamental difference between autocratic systems and democratic systems? So why is the democratic system unable to convince its population that even if it is in a fundamental legitimacy crisis, it can solve the problems by means of democracy, and that would imply by means of open speech, right? So if you ask Mrs. von der Leyen, of course, she will tell you, why can't we do this? Because our enemy, Russia, is subverting the legitimacy of our system by unfair means, right? So we never say, we don't have any impact on what is being discussed in Russia. We don't have any influence on any kind of elections that are being conducted in the European member states. But the other side, is sort of being unfair in subverting the confidence between our population and the ruling elite. Very interesting, very interesting argument. And of course, Russia is launching its propaganda to make its voice heard, the same as we launch our propaganda to make our voice heard. We're never being told that we are actually launching our propaganda to make our voice heard. We only hear the argument that they launched their propaganda and want to subvert our confidence in our system, which is a very strange argument, because if we actually had the confidence that the population of democratic countries actually love democracy, and for that reason, they are trained well enough to differentiate between an argument that is plausible and an argument that is not plausible, then we didn't need to be afraid of any propaganda coming in from Russia, right? I remember when I was a student, I was a member of the German Studienstiftung des Deutschen Volkes, which is sort of an organization that supports highly talented students. And we met every month in Bonn in a special building where you could read everything you wanted to read coming from the GDR. And you could listen to their daily news. And our professor would actually lead us to this building. Every month we had a meeting with him, and we would start by listening to the news that the GDR would bring to its people. Then we would go to his wonderful house, have a glass of wine, have a pretzel, and then analyze in detail, what kind of news these people were actually giving to them over there in the GDR, and what that meant for us in the western part of Germany. So this was, at the height of the student movement. So Germany was in a very, very severe legitimacy crisis. The young people were taking to the streets, questioning the validity of this system. But still, our professors at that time gave us the opportunity of understanding the other side, right? So I think this is actually very disappointing. And on the one hand side, you can sort of look at this situation from a very sort of cool point of view and say, you know what? So if a system is in crisis, it will always come to a point where it can only use coercive means in trying to preserve itself, right? But on the other hand, I'm not that cool, I must say. I want to live in a democratic country, and I want our politicians to show their ability to give legitimacy to this political system by means other than coercion, and by convincing the population that it is a good idea to live in a democratic country. And I'm very disappointed about our politicians obviously being so nervous about the situation that they don't even come to think about what kind of non-coercive means they could revert to in order to regain the confidence of the population.
I definitely agree with you. I also want to live in a democracy in Europe, which gives the individual the right to make their own decisions based on full information. So let us not forget that right after the war between Russia and Ukraine started, they, of course, blocked off all access to Russian information for European citizens. So, for instance, the access to RT was blocked. So they obviously didn't believe that the European citizen would be able to listen to these news items and maybe make their own opinion on what is true, what isn't true, but thought that they had to make a diktat of what the truth is, which they are now feeding us, instead of giving each person the ability just to listen to all the news and say, okay, I don't believe in this, I believe in this, but I would like to listen to both sides. I mean, obviously in a war, there is a fog of war that we are all under, not only with regarding to Russia and Ukraine, but also regard to Israel, US, and Iran's war. We really don't know what really is going on. But to have such a policy, such a diktat come from the top is really quite estranging. So I think of the proverb, you can fool some of the people all of the time and all of the people some of the time, but you can't really fool all the people all of the time. And I think this is what the European leadership is now discovering, that you really can't fool everybody all the time. At some point, the truth is going to emerge and you can't suppress it by any coercive means. I thought we'd shift now our discussion maybe to the EU's economic power, because as one always says, the EU is an economic giant and a political dwarf. And of course, after Donald Trump launched its tariff policies against the EU turned around. This is one of Ursula von der Leyen's great pushes this year. And she has gone around the world and making all these trade deals. We have Australia in March 2026, India in January 26. The Mercosur bloc also has been concluded. So these deals all aim to lower the tariffs on goods like agricultural products, automobiles, machinery, and want to deepen economic ties to enhance supply chains amidst this global insecurity and also its relationship with the US, where the EU doesn't really know where that's going. And of course, Prime Minister Sanchez of Spain has called on more cooperation with China. He's also not a great fan of Donald Trump. I think the feeling is mutual there. The European economy is the world's second largest economy by nominal GDP, estimated to be approximately 22.5 trillion in 2026, representing about 1/6 of the global economy. How do you see the future of the EU? Will it be united or more divided? And can it use its economic power to gain more political clout?
Well, I think if there is any future for Europe, it is the economic future. So if you look at the fact that EU member states actually sort of have about 80% of their international trade with other EU member state countries, you will see that, as a matter of fact, the EU as an economic organization is very much to the benefit of at least most of the member states. Of course, we also see that there are some weaknesses here. For example, if you look at Austria, among all the countries that are EU member states, Germany is the most important trade partner for Austria. And if we always say, if German economy runs into problems, so then we are in big shit here in Austria. So this is true for this moment, and this has always been true. But on the other hand, I think no matter whether we are looking at bigger countries or smaller countries, I think that the economy of these countries has greatly benefited from this European Union constellation. So from this point of view, the only sort of asset we have with the EU at this moment, from my point of view, is the fact that we have this common market. But once we go beyond the common market, we already run into trouble. This is also true for all the sort of economic aspects that go beyond just trading, because all the kind of strategic decisions that elites in their respective countries cannot take because of one or the other reason are suddenly strategic sort of plans that are being made in Brussels. So if you look at the constellation in Brussels with this enormous bureaucracy around the Commission, you will see many similarities with former socialist or communist countries that had a enormously big bureaucracy around a sort of decision-making elite. And this bureaucracy actually thought that they knew what the future was like. For that reason, they could take any kind of decision, plausibilizing it by saying, this is our future direction. This is where we have to go. This is what we need to do because we want to achieve this goal in future. And when you look at the wording coming from Brussels, for someone like me who has been reading the Remunerable, the People's Daily for now more than 50 years, I sometimes really feel shocked that the idea how things are being presented from Brussels are 100% how they were being presented in Peking for a long time and are now being presented from Peking too. So, for example, they give us quotas. In 2035, we have to achieve this goal. In 2025, we have to achieve this goal. Every person who has a little bit of a brain in his or her head knows that we cannot foresee the future, right? And if we make plans according to a future that we cannot foresee, we run into difficulties. And this is exactly what they're doing in Brussels. And you sometimes think, someone like me who was born in the 50s and grew up in the 60s and became a little bit aware of the world in the 1970s, where I remember vividly that we were being told that all these economies in the eastern part of Europe, including, of course, the economy of Russia, that they couldn't actually work because they had a planned economy with quotas. And these quotas were actually made up of something because you cannot foresee the future. And for that reason, you cannot define quotas. And now what do they do in Brussels? They do exactly this. This is, I think, something they should definitely stop right away. Then the second very interesting aspect is that because they think they understand the future, and in this context, this has very much to do with climate change, right? So they not only give us quotas, how many cars we can sell in what constellation and until which year, but they also sort of define laws that we then have to implement into national law that are, according to their understanding, which is the understanding of their bureaucracy, which are inducive in reaching this aim of tackling with the climate change issue. But so far, I think all the aims they have defined, not one of them has ever been reached. And secondly, there's reason to believe that some of these aims are built on non-robust grounds. So people don't believe in these kind of quotas. And then when you, on the top of imposing these quotas on the economies of the different member states, you impose laws that all individuals who somewhat are economic actors have to comply with these laws, then it is very natural to understand that if these laws actually impede you from developing your business, then your business elite will go against you. Very easy. I mean, everybody can concede that, but they're still doing this. And I think that this is sort of a very sort of interesting phenomenon. And I think maybe I don't know all the research, or maybe I'm right to say that there is not enough research about this. This sort of Brussels thing is very much like the Washington Hill, right? So it is a very closed group of people who only listen to each other and who only listen to a bureaucracy, which is selected for service on the grounds of whether or not they follow this main fundamental ideas of the EU, right? And this sort of develops an echo chamber, and they do everything. And I think the bureaucracy knows that it has to inhibit that any voice from outside this echo chamber will somewhat penetrate into this echo chamber. I've done lots and lots of research about China on this issue, and I found out it's so interesting. These people built an echo chamber, but around this echo chamber, there are many, many people who have different opinions and who come to different assessments. The moment this echo chamber suddenly develops a hole by which these information from outside can penetrate into the echo chamber, it doesn't take long for this echo chamber to actually be disturbed. It no longer exists. It can no longer be upheld, because the echo chamber can only sort of preserve its echo chamber character unless there is nothing from the outside penetrating into the echo chamber. And I think that this constellation of a decision-making elite on the one hand side, and then this enormous bureaucracy around it, sort of creates an echo chamber situation, which, by the way, is also existent in Washington. Is also, but to a lesser degree, existent in Peking. I'm not a Russia specialist, so I don't know about the situation in Moscow, but my feeling is that discussions among the elites in Moscow are now more lively than discussions in Brussels and in Washington. And the same is true for Beijing. So very interestingly, our sort of autocratic countries that are supposed to be the absolute opposite of what we are doing here seem to be, because they are under enormous pressures, their elites find ways to force the leadership into debate. And we have not reached this point at this moment. And I think from the structure of a regional organization, we will only be able to sort of relativize the echo chamber effect of what is going on in Brussels by member states sort of coming up with ideas that are not supposed to be articulated according to Brussels logic. I don't think that this split within the elite will sort of start from Brussels. It will start in the member states. And I don't think it will start with the political elite, but we see now already that the economic elite is actually now more and more outspoken in forwarding its demand for Brussels policies towards Russia, for example, to be changed.
Absolutely. And also one of these, the leadership in the EU is, of course, not democratically elected. I mean, that's where the whole problem begins. So if you want to draw parallels to the United States, you can at least say, yes, Donald Trump won the election because he said he was going to fight the swamp there. But the swamp in the EU, no one elected. No one elected Ursula von der Leyen or her ministers, which are called commissioners. They have been put there, placed there, and they have enormous power in making all these regulations on the size of the French fry, on whether to call a vegan burger a burger, and all these things, which, of course, as you mentioned, industry and businesses are just up in arms against, because what they're doing is just making life so much difficult for her. And there's no doubt that they make mistakes. And von der Leyen admitted to making a grave mistake in her Green New Deal when she said nuclear energy She was totally against nuclear energy and now had to make a total reversal and say, whoops, I made a mistake. Nuclear energy is green and we must support nuclear energy. So more or less accepting the French position. So Brussels bureaucracy, I think, is one of the main issues why maybe Europe isn't such a success story, because it has too much power and obviously makes mistakes and has not been elected by the people. So also, if we look at defense now, of course, everyone is saying we have to spend more on defense. We have to spend more on defense. Also looking at Russia, having Russia as the big enemy. The EU, of course, has PESCO, which is the Permanent Structure Cooperation, as the European Defense Fund, which is the EDF. Which is guided by a strategic compass. But of course, in the EU, foreign policy and defense, of course, still national sovereignty. Each country now is pushing for more defense spending. Of course, NATO is pushing for more defense spending but anything it would spend on defense, of course, it could not invest in European social welfare system, which of course is one of the pillars of European system, is that we have a strong social welfare system, which of course differentiates us from the United States, which does not offer that to its citizens. So do you think that the EU will continue coming together on defense, having a more common foreign policy? How can you make it more democratic? And will Europe and Russia come together? Will Europe and China come together? Who do you think the EU can rely on moving forward?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think one of the biggest problems the EU is meeting is the fact that the US is actually trying to somewhat get rid of a potential competitor in economic means, and at the same time make Europe really weak by withdrawing some of its security umbrella functions and therefore forcing Europe into sort of tackling this very difficult question, which, as you just mentioned, is a question of budget, but also a question of priorities, and it's also a question of geopolitics. Right? So if you look at sort of historical and current examples of regional organizations, you will see that the EU is actually an exception from the rule, and it's not the rule. Why is it an exception from the rule? Because of the fact that the EU member states are all nation states. And because of the fact that the EU was founded in order to avoid wars between European nation states for the future, we have this very interesting situation that all member states of the EU are equal. If you look into the research on regional organizations, you will find out that regional organizations have sustainability, or in former times we would say longevity, only if they have a so-called interested hegemon. So if there is one country in this regional organization that is more powerful as others, and these others actually acknowledge that there is one country that is more powerful than others, and this one country knows that all the other members of the regional organization actually support its leadership role, even though they might not always speak openly about this, right? So how could the EU, as the exception from the rule, actually persist, although it did not have one country among the membership states that was more powerful than others? Very interestingly, the only way the European Union could survive was because there was a hidden actor who was actually the interested hegemon, and this is the US. So when you, for example, if you go to a university in Europe and you study European studies and you focus on understanding the European Union, you will learn everything, but no single word about the US, because the US is the hidden actor here. You cannot say openly, you know what, we are all equal because we are all under the leadership of our overlord, who actually is not a member of our European Union, but who sits in Washington, right? Nobody is allowed to say this, although everybody knows this, right? And for that reason, I think we are now in a very precarious situation, because if the US does not want to provide this leadership, this hidden leadership function, which is actually a leadership function it can only provide because of its nuclear security umbrella. So if the US actually retreats from NATO, which many people anticipate, I'm not so sure whether they're actually doing this, but I'm quite clear that they're going to reduce their spending for Europe, let's put it that way. So in this situation, then what does the European Union do and what can the European Union do? So what we see at this moment is a fierce competition between two member states and one no longer member state. It is between Germany, France, and Great Britain. Of course, Great Britain now is in a very terrible situation. They thought they could play the role of Japan, lie in front of Europe, align with the US, and play the hegemon for Europe. Unfortunately, this doesn't work. So now they're actually pissed off because they're no longer members of the EU. They would be in a much better position for leadership competition if they were still a member of the EU. Unfortunately, they took the wrong decision. Okay, so now we have Germany and France, right? A little bit of Poland is also sort of in the background. But Poland, I think, according to my assessment, sort of plays the role of the third actor in this triangle. They want to go with France against Germany because they feel that Germany might be the winner of the competition unless France has yet another potent country that supports France. So that's why Poland sort of plays a comparatively important role. And that's why everybody feels that Poland is so important and Poland is the most beautiful country in the world and so on and so forth. This is because they all need Poland, this third actor, as a friend, right? So I think this is what we're seeing at this moment. And one of the reasons why we see the EU dividing itself so much, as we can observe, with every new challenge coming up, we have a new division inside the EU. I think this is because these competitors are also mobilizing different countries in support of themselves. And it's a very typical situation without a leader when a regional organization is actually looking for a leader. And we just talked about the question of whether or not we will have majority decisions or consensus decisions. Of course, we must understand that if we decide, or if our political leaders decide that in future we only need majority decisions, then these decisions will be decisions of the interested hegemon in the EU. And the whole struggle about this issue of majority or consensus is also a struggle by which countries can show their support to either of the competitors in this game, right? They can show support whether they want Germany to be the leading country or whether they want France to be the leading country. And I think there will also be quite a number of countries that neither want Germany nor France, and for that reason will maybe decide to leave the European Union. We see that the Shanghai Cooperation Organization is now in the process of building its own financial institution. I think many of the details of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization show that they actually analyzed the pros and cons for the EU setting. And wherever they find that the EU setting is very dangerous, it has sort of generated lots of criticism and division among the member states, they sort of tried to invent a different mode of collaborating between the countries and so on and so forth. They know that their biggest weakness lies in that they cannot distribute money the way that Brussels can distribute money to other member states. And for that reason, they are now developing a development bank, which will not sort of distribute money to member states, but give very beneficial loans to member states. And I think once this institution will have shown its potential, wait and see, if everything goes according to plan, then there will be countries on the fringe of the EU that will decide that they leave the EU and become a member of SCO, because there they're being guaranteed that the organization does not interfere with internal affairs in their respective countries. And for that reason, they are only looking for, the enormous amount of capital that is still flowing around in China and that is looking for places outside China to be invested. And for that reason, those countries on the fringe of the European Union, countries that have not been accepted yet, will eventually decide not to join the European Union, but to join, for example, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And for that reason, I think the European Union has to be really, really careful in what kind of decisions it's going to take. And at this moment, I don't really see how they can sort of overcome this very precarious situation in which they are in at this moment without defining Russia to be the arch enemy of Western Europe or of the EU member states, because this is the only way how they can at least sort of overcome to a certain degree all these divisions inside the EU membership. And I think that this is no good news, because we have to understand that Russia is now in an internal debate on whether or not they will have to attack in form of retaliation certain objects that are outside Ukraine, but inside a European member state, for example, Germany. And I think this would be a totally new level of escalation, and it would bring war to the rest of Europe. And I think that this is very unfortunate. But from a structural point of view, for these people who have to take decisions, if you don't have the US sort of forcing you into unity, the US withdraws from its position of forcing you into unity, then you need to define your unity by establishing the idea that Russia is the main threat to the well-being of the EU member states. And unfortunately, they know that they will not be militarily strong enough for the next years to come to actually fight a war against Russia. And for that reason, Ukraine has to continue fighting a war against Russia that, according to their calculation, will eventually make Russia weaker and weaker, while we, member states of the European Union, by way of developing our military capacities, will become stronger and stronger. And then eventually, when it comes to a war between the two, we will be the winners and they will be the losers. I think this is what we can see when we look at the strategy that was actually discussed in Germany yesterday and introduced to the public by Defense Minister Pistorius. This is actually what is at the back of his mind when he develops this so-called strategy for the German army to be the most powerful army among the European member states.
But isn't this kind of a scary future for the European Union, that all we have to do is become militarily so strong that we can win a war? Wouldn't it be better not to have to fight a war in the first place? And why is it that some countries have security interests that we take into account, like Israel's, for example, which is not even a member of the European Union, but is treated as a European country in effect, and Russia, which is a European country, which is not allowed to have any security interests. So NATO is allowed to put weapons right up to Russia's borders. We know exactly what the United States did with Cuba when a similar situation was brewing there. So, I mean, again, we have these double standards coming. And of course, Donald Trump is not very happy with his NATO friends. Most of them, of course, are in Europe or are in the EU, except for, of course, Turkey, which is a very important NATO ally. When Donald Trump asked for them to come to the Strait of Hormuz and help set up this blockade, and everyone said, no, we're not interested. So, as you said, the European Union is not able to defend itself. NATO, without the US, is not able to defend itself. So isn't it time for the EU to maybe change its policy and find a new outlook, as opposed to insisting that, Russia is the big enemy here? If it pursued a system of multi-alignment, which you have discussed also in previous podcasts we made, wouldn't it make sense for the European Union to have good relationships, not only with China and with the US, but also with Russia moving forward?
Well, from a strictly logical point of view, this is at least an alternative scenario for politicians that were sort of brought up during the Cold War and that are used to the so-called unipolar moment as what we experienced since the end of the Cold War. I think for them, the logic is that we have to either unite under the leadership of the US or unite against Russia or both, right? This is sort of the kind of logic they can easily follow. Whereas an alternative logic obviously is very difficult for them to design or to envisage. And it is very interesting to see that, for example, I'm a German citizen. I was brought up in the 1960s and 70s. I went to school and university in the 1960s and 70s, and I studied political science in Germany at that time. Very interestingly, we were taught at the time that there is one sort of thing we should learn from the Second World War, that war is no means to solve political problems. So we should always look for non-military means whenever we come across a geopolitical problems, rather than sort of thinking about military solutions to be the first solution. And I mean, those politicians who are now in power, they are a little younger than me, but basically I would say they were still brought up and educated under the same logic. So how come that they now suddenly think that war is the only solution to their problems? And I think here we can see how, different levels of the problem actually come together. So we have a major structural economic problem in all EU member states, right? Germany is at the very, very center of this problem, because Germany, with its enormous automobile industry, was very important for all kinds of countries around Germany as suppliers for parts of these automobiles. So now this industry is actually sort of declining, falling into pieces, or moving to China because it's better to produce automobiles there than in Germany. So under this situation, they come to the conclusion that they have to invent one sector of production where they can sort of use the kind of capacity, the knowledge, and the sort of sophistication they previously accumulated in the sector of the automobile industry, transfer it to a different sector, and there make good money by having a really good foundation for this sector to thrive. So it's very clear that from an economic point of view, to transfer all your knowledge, your workers and everything from the automobile industry to the military-related and weapon technology industry is very logical, right? And so in this context, you see how all these different pieces come together. Because if you want to develop your weapon industry, you have to tell the people why, right? So what is the reason why? It is because we have this potential enemy in the form of Russia in front of us. So we need to develop our technological industry in order not to sort of transform our industry from an automobile-driven industry into a weapon-driven industry, but because we need to have weapons in order to fight against this potential enemy. And so then you can put everything together. And when you talk about, like, for example, social security being one characteristics of what we have been experiencing in Europe in comparison, for example, to the US, but also in comparison to China. Well, then we can hear our politicians saying, of course, if our industry, if our economy doesn't run well, we cannot uphold a social security system. So we have to invent a new sector in our economy that actually will have the need of many of those workers that were originally employed in the automobile industry. They will create lots of taxes and all this kind of thing. And only if they thrive, then our social security system can thrive. So every one of us, including you and me, we actually should applaud to our politicians being so intelligent that they now realize that our new sector of our economy will finally bring a boom to our economy, and this boom will be good for our social security system, will be able to uphold our social security system. So this is how they're calculating all these different things. And I think I can only say, you know what? There are countries that actually tried to do this before us. Look at South Korea. South Korea is a country that developed its weapon technology industries comparatively early. They started about 20 to 25 years ago. When you look at the situation now, you will see that the social security system in South Korea is under enormous stress, and that more than 60% of the pension age population in South Korea are living below the poverty line. So is this a problem of South Korea? Or maybe is this a structural problem, and we should look at a little bit closer whether or not it's a structural problem, and whether or not in 10 years from now we'll realize, oh, our weapon industry is thriving. However, our social security system is no longer existing.
So there are so many issues here with Europe. We have the structural issue, we have the democratic issue, we have the relevance issue, we have division within. It's so divided within itself. It can't even focus on gaining more clout when it comes to foreign policy. The question is still unanswered whether Europe will regain relevance anytime soon, or if it's just destined to remain divided and as such actually remain irrelevant on the world stage. So many issues which would require much more time, but I think we have discussed many of the important points and given our listeners some good food for thought. I think that this would be a good point to stop our podcast. Suzanne, is there anything else you'd like to say?
Maybe you will allow me to sort of end on a little bit more optimistic note than all the awful things I've been talking about during the last minutes. So I think, that Europe actually has the potential to reinvent itself. We know that there are many examples in history around the world where countries or continents or even organizations like the European Union ran into enormous troubles and were able to solve the problems by taking bold decisions and reinventing itself. And I think that Europe has the potential, because we are under enormous pressure. We have the potential and we have the necessity to reinvent ourselves. And I think one of the most important things in this context is that we don't push our young people into sort of thinking about whether or not they will spend the next week in Paris or in Rome. But maybe we should sort of encourage them to think about their own future and be part of building their own future, rather than leaving it to those people that are my age or a little bit younger, and that have shown so far that they are lacking the curiosity and imagination to reinvent this continent. I think it is the young generation that needs to reinvent this continent. And if we can do something, we can support them, but they should take over the lead and show that we are not an aging society, but that Europe is still a society that is young enough to reinvent itself.
Well, that's a wonderful note to end with. And I think the young generation in Europe has strong opinions and has voiced them. And I hope that our leadership takes them into consideration when making its decisions, which affect all of us. I'd like to thank our listeners for tuning in to another session of iGlobenews. It's wonderful that we have so many listeners, and I hope that our followers, please make sure to write reviews on Spotify and YouTube so others can find us as well. The copyright for our podcast is iGlobenews. Thank you very much for tuning in.
Bye-bye.